grew up I had one, well, I still have one older sibling, a sister, and she, 2 grades ahead of me, almost 3 years older. Well, I have a picture from 1978 to give you a little shot of little Dusty and little Candace, my sister. She was a straight A student, like adored by all of, I mean, look at her, right? They adored her. Ah, she's so cute. And she just did everything right. And this was true at home as well. And so there was this normal thing that would happen when, small town, I would get a lot of the teachers that she had. And I would start in their class, and usually as a female teacher, and they would say, "Oh, you're Candace Frizzell's little brother. I'm so excited to have you in my class." And I'd be thinking to myself, "Ha ha, just wait, sucker," right? And it did not take long. I got a grown-up picture of my sister and I at the beach several years ago. So we ended up, like enjoying each other, and we actually look better now than we did in 1978, so that's good. But like if growing up as the little brother of Candace Frizzell was difficult, can you imagine growing up being a younger sibling of Jesus the Christ, right? I mean, can you imagine? Pretty amazing. This letter that we're starting, this letter in the New Testament called James, was written by a man named James to a group of Jewish Christians, and this was Jesus' little brother, literal little brother. Jesus had at least four that we know of from the Gospels, 4 brothers. He had at least 2 sisters, so you got at least 7 kids in this family. This is a large family. The father, Joseph, likely dies pretty early on, right? So you've got James, this guy who writes this letter that we're going to begin to read through in these next weeks, that grows up in a family of distress. When you've got likely a young mother who is a widow with 7 children. This may explain why James writes in what we call chapter 1, verse 27. He says, "Pure and faultless religion is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, to take care of the poor." Mark chapter 3 tells of a time when Mary, Jesus' mother, and his brothers come to Jesus to take him away because they thought he was crazy, right? Because he was saying things like, "I'm God's son. I am the Messiah." But then Jesus rose from the dead. He appears specifically to James. Paul actually mentions this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, if you're keeping score on stuff like this. In that list, he talks about Jesus appearing to over 500 people at one time, but he only mentions 2 specific people by name. Peter, the friend disciple who disowned him, and James, the little brother who punked him, who thought he was crazy. Jesus appears to James, and this changes everything. James becomes the primary leader in the first church in Jerusalem that you read about in the book of Acts. James writes his letter, the only written document that we have from this ancient world. He writes his letter from a place of after believing in Jesus. Unlike Paul, he's not trying to establish doctrines or work out like a philosophical argument for salvation. He's asking, the subtext is kind of like this: what does faith look like after you've trusted your life to Jesus? This is where James is coming from. What does it look like? And I think his answer throughout this short letter is that faith looks simple and profound, and it changes, or should change, everything. So after greeting these Jewish Christians that have been scattered throughout the nations, James begins his letter with what is really his theme throughout the letter, the book. And this theme is the reason that most people even come to religious texts, sacred writings. They're wanting to know about suffering and hardship and pain. Because how you look at hardship and how you deal with hardship will shape so much about the way you deal with the rest of your life. So what I want to do is I want to read James chapter 1, verses 2 through 12. And I want to pull out just 4 words that he actually uses and let those guide us tonight. The 4 words are consider, let, ask, and endure. Well, let's read first. Verse 2. After he sends greetings, James says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault. And when you ask, it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea blown and tossed by the wind. That person shouldn't expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. Verses 9 through 11, you can read them. I'm going to kind of skip them because I think they'll make more sense as we go through his letter. But for now, I'll point out this, that like his older brother, James warns the rich and he lifts up the poor. And in verse 12, blessed is the one who endures under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. Okay, first word, consider. I want to read verse 2 again. Consider it pure joy, brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kind, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Now, notice James says when or whenever you face trials, not if, right? This is just kind of common, basic human understanding. That struggle is a default in the human experience. It just is. And faith, Christian faith, is not an insurance policy against pain. It's something like a rich and deep perspective so that you can deal with it. Now, he says the phrase, whenever you face trials of many kind. This word to face is literally to run into, right? To stumble upon. The idea here is that he's not talking about like personal consequence of sinful choices. But don't worry, he will. That'll be next week for us, verses 13 and 14. But what he's saying is that every single one of us as human beings, we are going to face and fall into trials and pains and hardships of all kind. So he's saying, when you do, consider it an opportunity for joy. Consider. This word in the ancient world, it was an accounting word. It literally means do the math. As you look at something, add it up. Put the pieces together, filter it, see it in a certain way. So here's how I would give it. When you struggle, consider the divine math with kingdom eyes so that you can see beyond. And when you do that, there's joy on the other side. Now, joy is not happiness. Most of you know this, right? Happiness comes from the word happenstance. It means like what's going on. And if what's going on is good, then you're happy. If what's going on is bad, then you're sad or something other than happy. That's not what joy is. Joy is a choice. I would define it as a choice to celebrate the fact that you're loved by God no matter what. You're choosing to celebrate it no matter what. You're choosing to celebrate the fact that you're loved by God no matter what's going on. This is a choice. This is joy. And simple faith is not silly faith. James is not advocating that you and I ignore justice. No, you'll see plenty of the opposite. He's not advocating that we ignore the reality of real pain in our life. This simple faith instead has eyes to see beyond it. James says when you fall into hardship, there's joy, because if you'll look beyond it and walk through it God's way, Jesus' way, you can know it will produce perseverance. Perseverance, this word literally means a patient continuing. To continue something patiently. Here it is. I know you've heard this phrase before. It is consistent character. That's what James is saying. You're going to face hard times, and when you do, you can consider it joy, because if you'll look at it a certain way, God's way, and go through it God's way, it will produce in you perseverance, a patient continuing of doing good, consistent character. And I'm not sure if you've heard, but character is everything. It is everything. Character is who you are, how you respond, and how you treat others. Character is shaped one decision at a time, but our choices are born really out of how we see the world, how we consider it. Let me tell you the story. I don't know if I've ever told this one before. If I have, too bad. It's a good one. There's an organization in Montana that offered a $5,000 bounty for for every live wolf that trappers could get, that take them alive and bring them to the state. And two hunters, can't make this up, Sam and Jeb. And Jeb, they decide to head for the hills to make some money, right? They're out camp, they don't find anything all night. They set up camp, they're in their tent, they go to sleep. Sam wakes up and he hears the growls, the snarls, and he realizes they're surrounded. Their tent is surrounded by a pack of wolves ready to pounce. And Sam leans over and he wakes Jeb up and says, Jeb, bro, wake up. Get your shoes on because we're going to be rich, right? Yeah, what you and I saw is, oh my gosh, I'm going to die. And Sam sees $5,000, $5,000, $5,000, $5,000, $5,000. Wake up! Get your gun. The crucified, resurrected, new life, faith in Jesus that James advocates. It is not a call to ignore pain and injustices in our world, and it certainly isn't a call to victimhood. Instead, the way that you can still see the ocean as you look beyond it to the sunset. This perspective of Jesus' joy equips us to consider what lies beyond our pain to the growth of our soul. And I appreciate that while James advocates for a simple faith, he is never once seduced, at least in this letter, by simple-minded cliches regarding suffering. You read his letter, there is no, everything happens for a reason. There's not even like God did it so that he could bring good out of it. Maybe those things are true. Maybe those cliches are true. I think often they're born out of people that are hurting and being lazy in their mind on how the world works. But that's just my opinion. I'm certain I could be wrong. But think about this, the way that Genesis, the first book of the Bible, the way that Genesis assumes God's existence with its very first line, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the same way, James assumes the human experience will be littered with trial. You will not be able to get away from it, Christian or not. You will go through hard times. So James says, look with joy beyond it to what it can produce. Consider. And then let. James chapter 1, verse 4. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Let consistent character, a patient, continuing in good character, finish its work so that you can grow up in your faith and be mature. Listen, God desires to grow your character through the very inevitable trials that will come your way that you didn't create. But he will not force you to grow through them. Our God is a gentleman. And this is just true. Hardships will happen and you have a choice, and so do I, a responsibility really, to let perseverance, the continuing character, finish its work from inside the trial. The New Testament reveals at least, that I can count, 3 different works involved in completing. That word is not finished, like done with. There's no more work to be done. Like 3 works to mature a believer. And I think these are fill-ins. The first one is that it's God's work for us. It's God's work for us that you can't do anything about. It's grace, it's forgiveness, it's connection. You can receive it, but that's it. God's work for us, God's work in us, that's sanctification, confidence, peace, a renewed mind. And then there's God's work through us. That's the Ephesians 2 masterpiece, the good works God planned in advance from the beginning of time. The 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 9, we are co-laborers, partners in the gospel, in all that God is doing around the world, God's work through us. But here it is, you have to let God. You have to let God's work for it to work. That was good. If I was taking notes, I would have taken notes on that because that just happened. But you have to let God's work for it to work. I know, I'm excited about that sentence, I can't help it. And character formation is often painful. I mean, living God's way, it's simple and yet it's profound. It's healing and yet it can provide wounds. Building the character muscles of honesty, of owning your mistakes, of treating people how you want to be treated without favoritism, right? Character formation is painful, but you got to let it happen so you can get to what's on the other side. What's on the other side? Well, there's a lot, but things like a depth of courage. This is what my almost 15-year-old son and I were talking about on the way home. That you so often in big, scary moments, what we were talking about, he's begun to read the news, which isn't always a good thing, right? And he was wondering, what would I have done in that, if I was in that mosque in New Zealand? What would I have done? Dad, I think I would have. And so I asked a lot of questions, and I took it as an opportunity to say, you know what we do in moments when we really aren't able to think because fear and adrenaline flood our brain? You know what we do? He said, what? We do what we train ourselves to do. We do our habits. We do the things the muscles we've been building every day when things are not chaotic and crazy. It's the patient continuing within a life of character. And in those moments, what you'll find is you will leak out. And that can be a wonderful, beautiful thing. Or it can be a very damaging revelation. Character formation is painful, but let God's work so you can get to the stuff on the other side. You get strength of integrity, peace knowing that not only did you survive the trial, but you held on to your soul through it. Consider, let, and ask. James says, if any of you lack wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously without finding fault. It'll be given to you, but when you ask, you must believe and not doubt. The one who doubts is like a wave of the sea blown and tossed by the wind. Wisdom begins in knowing that there's so much you don't know, but knowing who to ask about all that you don't know. This is where wisdom begins. It begins in humility, that there's so much that you don't know. And as you go through trials, there's often, sometimes because the brain doesn't work properly during conflict and hardship, and other times because you've not experienced this thing and you don't know what to do. And James says, well, of course, you're a follower of Jesus. Go to him. Go to God and ask for wisdom. Wisdom is simply choosing what is best. But the context here is to ask God for wisdom to continue through the trial in a way that honors God's way, in a way that holds on to your soul, in a way that is able to utilize and dig deep from the well of continued character that you've been building all this time. When you go through hardship, pray for strength to get through it, for protection in it, but always ask for wisdom not to waste it. Don't waste the trial. I read a story of a young man who was appointed president of a bank. He's a young leader. And this was more than he'd ever imagined, so he went to the older, time-honored chairman of the board to ask for advice on how to become a good bank president. What's the most important thing for me to do as a new president? He asked the older man. The man said, you got to make right decisions. That was his answer. The young man thought about that, and he said, thank you, that's very helpful. But can you be a little more specific? How do I make the right decisions? The old man says, experience. The younger man gets frustrated and says, but sir, that's why I'm here. I don't have experience. I don't have the experience. I need to make wise decisions. How do I get experience? By making the wrong decisions, the old man says. When you ask, James says, believe. Don't be tossed back and forth. This is not an insult, by the way. It's not meant to be. James is using really good Hebrew logic here. Because without the anchor of belief that God is present and good, remember it says that God will generously give all this. Here in just a few verses, James talks about God being a generous father who gives gifts to his children. Without the anchor of belief that God is present and good, how would you even be able to receive a wisdom that is based on the joy of perspective? If you don't have that anchor of who God is and how, at least a base knowledge of how God works, if you're tossed in that, how would it even work for you to receive it? So he's not like, it's not supposed to be one of those things, although maybe if you read it like this, it kind of proves the point. I don't know. But is it meant to be a thing of like, oh, God's mad at me, he's not going to answer me because I'm immature? It's how could you receive that kind of wisdom? God's answer to your request for wisdom, if you're tossed back and forth about the very basic anchor of who you're at. It's like this. It'd be like asking God for a pair of glasses when deep down you really didn't believe that your face existed, let alone ears and a nose to hang them on, right? Like it just doesn't make good sense. So James says, there is a promise for wisdom in the trial, but James never says that there's a promise that God will take away the trial or the pain. And this is key. Some religious people, they subscribe to a mystical prayer of faith whereby God bends to their will and does things how they want, how they think things should be done, right? There's people that not only believe this, but they live in this. They give advice in this way. While mysteriously, I'm just going to step into their belief for a minute, that God will bend to my will, that ultimately God wants to take me out of every struggle and every trial. Maybe religious people believe this because that's often how parenting is these days, right? Like this helicopter saved the child from everything. But if we step into this logic, let's think of this for a minute. God bends to this mysterious prayer of faith that will do things the way you want it and how you want it. While mysteriously God withholds it, we see it all the time, evidently, that he withholds it from people around the world who, in my estimation, are eminently more needing of the request and more deserving than you or me. So if this is your practice, then you've attained a knowledge that's been hidden from me. And if you sense some sarcasm here, I would hope so, because I'm laying it on pretty thick. And that was a reference to Tommy Boy for any people who watch really old movies. I tried to make it nice at the end since I just punched you in the theological gut. Okay, maybe not you. But listen, when you face struggle and trial and pain, you have to consider beyond it. There's joy there. Then choose to let character formation do its work and ask for wisdom to walk through it with grace and integrity and in the footsteps of James's big brother. And final word. Endure. Verse 12 says, blessed is the one who endures under trial. Because having stood that test, the person receives a crown of life the Lord has promised to those who love him. Endure, stay the course, do the next good thing, and then do the next good thing, and then do the next good thing. And we're talking about when you're in the midst of the trial, the hardship, the suffering, the pain that you didn't choose. You do the next good thing. You continue to continue in building this life of character, because character is a cumulative snowball. And James says there's a crown, there's a reward. And I guess that most religious people read this as that you endure the trial, there's a reward after this life. But James doesn't say that. Now, maybe he meant that. I don't know. He didn't give us enough language to know for one way or the other. Probably confirmation bias theory, whichever way you're looking for, that's how you'll see it. Maybe he means it like that. I don't know. But I know that if he's anything like his older brother, Jesus spoke very little about heaven and hell in the next life. Some, but little. But he spoke a lot about how we create both with our choices here and now, in this life. I do think the best is yet to come. I do think there's good stuff on the other side of this life. But in this life, when you commit to God's perspective, I believe that you and I find ourselves crowned with a joy and a peace and growth as you inevitably face hardship in your life. And besides, if you want to make crowns all about what you kind of reward you get in the next life, then here's something for you. The book of Revelation actually gives us a depiction, which is, massively symbolic anyway, but it gives us a depiction of people who've been given crowns in heaven. People who've been given crowns in heaven. In that one depiction, you know what we got? When the Lamb shows up, the Lamb is the symbol of Jesus, the Son of God. When he shows up, you know what they do with their rewards? They lay them at his feet. So, again, whether I'm right or wrong in what James is going at, I don't even know that I have an opinion. I would just say it's probably both. Some kind of reward for the next life and this life. No one really knows what the rewards are. No one knows what the next life really is. It's just good and with God. We know that, right? So what it means, I don't know. So I want to focus here and now because that's what James's big brother did. Endure. My wife has lupus. She's had it for some time now. Lupus is an inflammatory disease where her immune system, it attacks its own tissues. Now, I haven't really talked about it because, and I'm being honest, it just could be so much worse, right? Like, we're not super young. We're not super old either, but we've been alive long enough to know that there are a lot worse things someone could go through. But it sucks. Bad. I hate it. Seems like every month there's some new kind of pain or a different symptom, right? And Amy's one of those people that, you would actually choose to take it from her on yourself just because she's just better than you. You know what I mean? Like, it wouldn't deserve, not that anybody deserves diseases. But there's this telling a hard, truth about my wife's life clearly means there should be a good movie quote here. And there is. A movie her and I have watched for years, a movie called Tombstone, about the legendary Western figures Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. And Doc Holliday is dying of tuberculosis in a hospital room, and he asks Wyatt, who's there at his bedside, says, "Wyatt, what do you want?" And Wyatt says, "Doc, I just want to live a normal life." And here's the line. Doc replies, and he says it in an accent, country boy, kind of see if I can do it. I'm from Missouri. Surely I can do it. He says, "There is no normal life, Wyatt. There's just life. So get on with it." And my wife and I use that line a lot over the years. We'll quote it, usually just to have fun, and some implication about something in the world. We use Doc's country accent, but also it's a solid reminder that life is life. And of course, life can be hard. What other kind of world could we imagine right now that would actually be a world? I probably should. You can imagine a lot of things, but that actually can be a world with free will. But the juice is in the getting on with it. It is what it is. That's where James starts. Moses starts with, in the beginning, God. There's a God. Listen, you already know. In the beginning, God created. And in James, writing to his friends, consider it. Do the math. Put on kingdom-filtered glasses. And consider it joy when you face all kinds of trials. Because you know that if you live through this God's way, there's this continual character growth, that there's joy there. There's change, there's growth for your soul. Because how you consider the world matters. So keep looking up. Here's how I want to close. I'm quite certain I've told this story before, this ancient story from the Midrash. The Midrash is a ancient commentary on the Old Testament. These rabbis in between Old Testament, New Testament, they were writing commentary on the Old Testament. All kinds of stuff. Some of it imaginary, all kinds of good stuff. And there's a story in the Mishnah about these two Israelites, Reuben and Shimon. And they're walking across the Red Sea. So this is the story of Exodus, and Moses has led the people of Israel, the Hebrew people, out of 400 years of slavery in Egypt, and they're running away from Pharaoh. There's like 1 million of them. And Pharaoh is chasing them down, and God has Moses raise his staff and against the Red Sea, and the Red Sea parts, and wind pushes it back all night. And they walk through on dry land, and Reuben and Shimon are walking through, looking down the whole time. And they're complaining about how muddy it is. It's nasty mud going through their toes. And it feels like it's raining. Is it raining? They never look up to see. They're just complaining. Of course there's water. The sea is split in two. It's held up by wind, and water is coming down, right? Sprinkling down. And they begin to wonder out loud what all the commotion is on the other side. It sounds like there's a party. There's all the other Israelites that are already crossed because there was this massive miracle that God did where he saved his people. But for Reuben and Shimon, no miracle was done because of the way they considered the world. I mean, they only paid attention to the mud, which is a reality, right? I mean, it's not like they didn't walk through on very damp sand, rocks. Some of them, I'm sure, slipped and cut themselves and got hurt. None of that. You don't ignore any of that. But if you never look up to see what's beyond it, then you miss out on the most beautiful part of being human. Because there is a great paradox here. You ever listen to older people reminisce? Your parents? What are the stories they tell around the fireplace at Christmas time? When dad gets really going at the dinner table and they're thinking back to him and mom way back in the day, what stories do they tell? The easiest moments of their life? No. That's not how this whole thing works. There's so much beauty in facing the inevitable difficulties of life God's way, with your soul, with integrity and honesty and depth of courage. And it doesn't mean that you don't walk away from that with bruises and scars, deep ones often. But there is joy in that kind of life. And that's why James starts there. There is no normal life, friends. There's just life. So get on with it. Head up, eyes open. Don't miss it. What's beyond the pain that you're walking in right now? Look beyond it to the potential of growth as you're led by a good Father who loves you with mad love. We're gonna sing. I'm not even going to show you how many minutes I have left on my phone. It's amazing. I could preach a whole other sermon. But I don't want to get too distracted by being so proud of myself. Would you stand with me? I just want to pray over you. Louie and Brianne are going to lead us in some songs, and I think probably the most obvious reality is the fact that some of you in this room are going through what maybe in retrospect someday will be one of the hardest times of your life. With this many people, there's certainly that possibility. And whether it is going to be one of the hardest ones, it may just feel really hard. And that's very real. And I only want to offer you the scriptures tonight. This scripture. the kid that grew up in the same house as Jesus. You thought he was mad. Which, by the way, can we just pause and say, like, there's nothing I can ever give you to prove to you that the Bible's from God, that Jesus died and rose from the dead. I can't prove. What does prove mean? I can't prove it. But it's pretty wicked that, like, Jesus had brothers and sisters that thought he was crazy, but then they didn't, and then they, like, called him Lord, right? And James, like, led the whole thing. I used to think my brother was crazy, but come on into worship, I'm going to preach, right, about him. I mean, that's amazing. And for those of you going through unbelievable difficulties right now, I don't want to offer you anything that isn't offered to you from the Lord and from the Scriptures. And part of that, and it is certainly not just hang in there, someday it'll be over. It's certainly not like just pray that God will take it all away. It is certainly not to act as if it's not bad. That's weird. Like, I don't know, that's got to be like some kind of cult or something where you pretend like it's not pain. Instead, it is this beautiful invitation to look beyond it. You're still looking at it. You're looking beyond it to what can be produced through it if you're living God's way. And maybe that's the great question tonight. Are you on the path of Jesus? Are you following in the footsteps of Jesus? Do you take up your cross and follow him? Are you living in resurrected life? If not, being human's hard enough, right? But without Jesus, I don't understand it, right? So, Lord Jesus, I pray as we stand here, God, as I would assume there are some here tonight who want to find the good and find the joy and beg you for your wisdom. Spirit, would you give them the perspective and the childlike faith to come to the Father just as they are, with whatever rage and railing that is within them. And then, Spirit, would you help them see beyond to the fruit of soul growth, of character growth, of integrity that can be shaped during this time if they walk through it hand in hand with you. Father, I thank you that you're a dad that doesn't pluck us out of the storms, and thank you that your sole purpose in existence is not to make my life comfortable and rich. But thank you, Jesus, that in you and in the cross, there's more meaning and beauty packed there than we'll ever be able to excavate in a lifetime. And so with that, God, I pray a prayer of hope over my friends that are here tonight that are struggling, that are in the midst of a trial, of a hardship. And I pray, God, that if nothing else, that they would leave literally and metaphorically with their heads up, because they'll walk away with hope, believing that, as Paul wrote, that you're able to work good through all things in those who love you and those who live in the path of Jesus. So God, as we worship and as we respond, I pray that we would commit ourselves to you, that we would be reminded of your love for us. And I pray all of this, Jesus, in your name.